In this episode, we turn to the risk profile, which is one of the most practical tools an organization uses to make sense of its exposure in a structured way. For a beginner, the phrase can sound formal, but the idea behind it is very straightforward. A risk profile is the organization's organized picture of the risks that matter to its objectives, assets, processes, and decision-making, presented in a way that leaders can actually use. Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, CRISC, this topic matters because risk management cannot stay effective if the business only talks about threats in random meetings or reacts to each issue as if it exists all by itself. The organization needs a living view of what it is exposed to, how serious that exposure is, where the major patterns are, and how those conditions are changing over time. That is what a risk profile helps provide. It turns scattered concerns into a usable picture that supports governance, prioritization, accountability, and better decisions across the enterprise. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to understand a risk profile is to think of it as a structured summary of the organization's most relevant risks rather than a huge pile of disconnected issues. It is not supposed to be a dramatic catalog of every bad thing that might ever happen. It is supposed to help leadership and managers understand which risks are significant, why they matter, what business areas they affect, and how those risks compare to one another. This matters because organizations are rarely short on possible problems. They are usually short on attention, time, and the ability to see which concerns deserve the most disciplined focus. A strong risk profile makes that easier by connecting risks to business objectives, asset importance, process dependencies, and the organization's broader operating environment. For a beginner, the most important lesson is that a risk profile is not just a document to satisfy a formal requirement. It is a way of helping the business see itself clearly enough to act with intention instead of drifting from one issue to the next without a stable sense of priority. Developing a risk profile begins with understanding the organization well enough to know what is worth profiling in the first place. That means leadership and risk professionals need to understand strategy, goals, critical processes, key assets, important dependencies, regulatory pressures, and the business environment surrounding the organization. A risk profile that ignores business reality will quickly become weak because it will either highlight the wrong issues or describe real issues in ways that do not help anyone make decisions. If a company depends heavily on customer trust, sensitive data, and digital service availability, those realities should shape which risks receive attention. If a different organization depends more on manufacturing continuity, third-party logistics, or accurate financial reporting, its profile will naturally emphasize different exposures. This is one reason the topic belongs where it does in CRISC. A risk profile does not appear from nowhere. It grows out of governance, business understanding, asset awareness, and process knowledge. Without those foundations, the profile may look organized on paper while still failing to represent what could truly interfere with the organization's success. Another important point is that a risk profile is built from risk information that has already been identified and analyzed in a meaningful way. The profile is not the same thing as raw observation. Many organizations notice issues, control gaps, operational weaknesses, vendor concerns, or changing threats, but they still need some method for judging which of those conditions rise to the level of meaningful risk. That means development usually depends on prior work such as risk identification, scenario analysis, impact discussion, likelihood judgment, control review, and comparison across business areas. The profile then draws from that work and presents the most decision-relevant picture. For a beginner, this distinction is very useful. The risk profile is not the first thought the organization has about uncertainty. It is the organized result of disciplined thinking about uncertainty. That is why CRISC treats it as a management tool rather than a brainstorming tool. It helps leaders see the most important exposures in an ordered way after the organization has already done the work of turning vague concern into assessed business risk. A strong risk profile also depends on good categorization, because leaders need a way to group and understand risk without reducing everything to noise. Risks may be categorized by business function, process, asset type, operational area, strategic theme, or some other structure that makes sense for the organization. The goal is not to force every issue into a rigid box for administrative comfort. The goal is to make it easier to compare risks, detect patterns, and understand where concentrations of exposure may be building. For example, a business might notice that several different risks all connect to third-party dependency, weak change control, poor data quality, or uneven governance across regions. Those patterns may not be obvious if each issue is viewed alone. A profile helps the organization step back and see the larger themes. This matters because leaders often need more than a description of one event. They need a view of whether the business is becoming more exposed in particular areas and whether local issues are actually signs of an enterprise-level weakness that deserves broader attention. Prioritization is one of the most valuable things a risk profile provides, because very few organizations can address everything at once. Once risks have been identified, assessed, and grouped meaningfully, the business still has to decide what deserves the most immediate attention, what can be monitored closely, and what may remain acceptable within approved boundaries for now. A risk profile helps that prioritization by showing relative significance rather than leaving every team to argue for its own concerns in isolation. This is especially important in larger organizations where different departments may feel intense pressure around their own issues without always seeing the broader enterprise picture. A risk profile creates a more balanced basis for comparison. It helps leadership see not only which risks are serious, but which ones affect the most critical objectives, which ones cut across multiple business areas, and which ones are likely to create consequences that the organization cannot absorb comfortably. In this way, the profile becomes a tool for disciplined focus rather than a passive report that simply describes problems without helping anyone decide where effort should go first. Ownership is just as important in the development of a risk profile as it is in any other part of risk management. Someone must be responsible for making sure the profile is built, reviewed, updated, and communicated in a way that remains useful. That ownership may sit within an enterprise risk function, a governance structure, or another part of the organization depending on how the business is designed, but regardless of placement, responsibility must be clear. At the same time, development cannot happen well if ownership turns into isolation. A risk profile usually requires input from business leaders, process owners, technology teams, security professionals, compliance functions, and other stakeholders who understand different parts of the organization's exposure. The right model is usually coordinated ownership, not solitary ownership. One function may lead the effort, but the content has to reflect the knowledge of the people closest to the work. That is one reason this topic is so practical. A risk profile is only as good as the quality of the conversations behind it, and those conversations depend on clear accountability combined with real engagement from the parts of the business that know where meaningful exposure actually exists. A risk profile is also valuable because it supports communication between technical and business audiences. Many organizations struggle with risk discussions because technical specialists describe exposures in operational terms, while business leaders need to understand what those exposures mean for objectives, obligations, trust, and decision-making. A well-developed profile can help bridge that gap by translating technical, operational, and governance concerns into a more useful enterprise picture. Instead of presenting leaders with scattered details about system weaknesses, isolated incidents, or control exceptions, the profile shows where the meaningful concentrations of risk are and why they matter to the organization's direction and stability. That does not mean the profile should hide operational detail completely. It means the profile should elevate the information into a form leadership can act on. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest ways to see why the topic matters. The risk profile is not just about documentation. It is also about making sure important exposure can be understood by people who are accountable for business outcomes, even if they are not the ones closest to every technical or operational condition underneath that exposure. Maintenance is what keeps a risk profile from becoming outdated, misleading, or merely ceremonial. This part of the topic is especially important because many organizations can create a profile once, present it with confidence, and then quietly allow it to drift away from reality as the business changes. A risk profile must be maintained because objectives change, systems evolve, vendors shift, regulations move, new projects introduce fresh exposure, and previously minor issues may grow into major themes. If the profile is not reviewed and refreshed, leaders may continue relying on an old picture that no longer reflects the actual business environment. That creates a dangerous form of false confidence. The organization believes it understands its major risks, but the understanding is based on conditions that may already be outdated. CRISC emphasizes maintenance because good risk management is continuous. A useful risk profile has to stay close enough to current reality that it can still support prioritization, escalation, response planning, and oversight. Otherwise, it becomes historical paperwork rather than a living management tool. Maintaining the profile means watching for triggers that should cause the organization to revisit its view of risk. Some reviews happen on a regular schedule, which is useful because periodic discipline helps keep the process active. But maintenance should not depend only on the calendar. It should also respond to meaningful changes in the business. A merger, a new product launch, outsourcing of a critical process, a major control failure, a new regulatory obligation, a serious incident, a change in leadership direction, or a shift in customer expectations can all affect what belongs in the profile and how risks should be presented. This is where the profile becomes dynamic rather than static. It is not simply reissued because a date arrived. It is reconsidered because the conditions that shape enterprise exposure have moved. For a beginner, this is an important lesson. Maintenance is not a clerical refresh. It is the continued work of asking whether the organization's most important risk picture still matches what the business is actually facing now, not just what it faced the last time people gathered in a conference room to talk about it. Monitoring and reporting are closely connected to maintenance because the organization needs evidence that conditions are changing, controls are strengthening or weakening, and issue trends are moving in meaningful ways. A risk profile should therefore be informed by the kinds of information that show what is happening across the business, such as control performance, exception patterns, incident themes, unresolved issues, major audit concerns, and shifts in the external environment. This does not mean the profile should become a dumping ground for every available metric. It means maintenance should draw from evidence that helps update the organization's understanding of material exposure. A profile that never changes despite major incidents, recurring findings, or visible business shifts is a sign that the maintenance process is not functioning well. In CRISC terms, maintenance works best when reporting feeds insight rather than just volume. The organization should be asking what the information means for the profile, which risks are becoming more or less significant, and whether existing assumptions still hold. That is how the profile stays relevant instead of slowly separating itself from the evidence available in the business. Another important aspect of maintenance is recognizing that risk interconnections can change over time. A risk profile should not treat every exposure as permanently isolated. Sometimes the more important development is not that one risk became slightly worse, but that several risks are now linked through a common dependency, common control weakness, or common business change. For example, a shift to new technology may affect vendor dependence, resilience expectations, access management, and data handling all at once. A staffing shortage may create quality concerns across multiple processes rather than inside only one team. A risk profile that is maintained well will begin to reflect those changing relationships and concentrations instead of continuing to present risks as though they exist in separate compartments. This is one reason maintenance is intellectually demanding and not merely procedural. The organization has to keep asking whether the overall shape of exposure is changing, not just whether individual items have gone up or down slightly. That broader view is part of what makes the profile useful to leadership, because leaders need to see patterns and concentrations, not just a series of disconnected updates. A few common mistakes can weaken both development and maintenance. One mistake is trying to make the profile exhaustive, which often produces something so crowded that it no longer helps anyone prioritize. Another is making it too shallow, where the profile sounds polished but gives little real insight into why certain risks matter or how they compare. A third mistake is treating the profile like a compliance artifact that gets refreshed mechanically without serious discussion about whether it still reflects business conditions. Yet another is failing to involve the right stakeholders, which can leave the profile technically neat but disconnected from how important processes and dependencies actually operate. For beginners, these mistakes are useful to understand because they show that the value of a risk profile comes from judgment and relevance, not from length or formality. A strong profile is focused enough to support decision-making, broad enough to reflect enterprise conditions, and actively maintained enough that leadership can trust it as a current view rather than as a historical snapshot with a fresh date on top. A simple example helps make the topic more concrete. Imagine a healthcare organization with major dependencies on patient scheduling, clinical systems, billing operations, third-party vendors, sensitive records, and staff availability across multiple sites. A weak risk profile might list general concerns such as cyber threats, vendor issues, and operational disruption without showing how those risks affect patient care, cash flow, legal obligations, or public trust. A stronger risk profile would connect those exposures to critical processes, show where dependencies are concentrated, indicate which issues are rising in significance, and reflect changes such as new service lines, staffing pressure, or recurring third-party problems. If maintenance is active, the profile would evolve as incidents occur, vendors change, regulations shift, or clinical operations expand. Leadership would then have a much more realistic basis for prioritizing actions, assigning responsibility, and deciding where additional control or oversight is needed. That example shows why the risk profile matters so much. It gives the organization a living enterprise picture of exposure rather than a scattered collection of concerns that never quite turns into usable management insight. By the end of this discussion, the main lesson should feel very clear. A risk profile is the organization's structured view of its most meaningful risks, presented in a way that supports comparison, prioritization, ownership, and better decision-making. Development depends on understanding the business, gathering assessed risk information, organizing it meaningfully, and presenting it in a form leadership can use. Maintenance depends on keeping that picture alive as conditions change, evidence accumulates, and the relationships among risks evolve. That is why this topic matters so much in CRISC. The organization cannot govern risk well if its view of exposure is random, outdated, or disconnected from business objectives. A well-developed and well-maintained risk profile helps the enterprise see what matters, where attention belongs, and how its risk picture is shifting over time. In other words, it turns risk management from scattered awareness into a disciplined, current, and much more actionable understanding of the business itself.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.